Mr. Speaker, after 9 years, the NDP Liberals are simply just not worth the cost. Low-income Canadians are now spending 80% of their income on housing and food.
That's insane.
The NDP Liberals' housing and food inflation is forcing millions of Canadians to rely on food banks. Still, this Liberal government is hell-bent on continuing to increase the cost of groceries by their punishing carbon tax. Will the Prime Minister give Canadians the carbon tax election that they so desperately need?
The Honourable Minister for Families, Children and Social Development.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we're making investments to help support families and children across this country. We've seen almost 1 million families who have benefited from our $10 a day national child care program. We've seen 3.5 million families who are receiving our Canada Child Benefit each and every month, providing much-needed support. We've seen CCB help lift hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. These are investments that we're making on this side of the House to ensure that we're there for Canadians and families.
The Honourable Member from Battleford's Lloydminster.
Mr. Speaker, that Liberal government is pushing Canadians to the brink, and they should be ashamed of their carbon tax fixation.
33% of household income is what you used to be able to spend maximum on housing.
Housing costs have doubled, and food bank usage has soared past 2 million visits per month. It has gotten so dire that 30% of food banks are now running out of food. Mr. Speaker, it's quite simple. Will the Prime Minister call a carbon tax election so that Conservatives can offer Canadians some relief?
Temporary foreign workers or student visas have been people within those demographics have been abusing
anything seriously that comes from
food banks.
The House. If there was an actual volition to address child poverty, maybe they wouldn't have sent checks to millionaires and then taxed that money back. If there was an actual volition to address child food security, maybe they would get behind the National School Food Program. All they know is cuts. And what does that mean? That means cuts to taxes if you're rich and cuts to services if you have less. That's not what we stand for on this side of the House. We'll continue to fight for Canadians.
The Honourable Member from Cumberland Colchester.
After 9 years, the NDP Liberals are not worth the cost, and Canadians are hurting. This government has made life miserable for Nova Scotians with their crushing carbon tax that has increased food prices by 23%. And of course, on top of that, they plan to quadruple the carbon tax. What's the result? 53% more Nova Scotians are going to food banks now than 5 years ago. Almost 40,000 Nova Scotians rely on food banks every month, 12,000 of whom are children. Will the Prime Minister call a carbon tax election?
Yeah.
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, it is extremely difficult to take a question of that nature from a Conservative member who himself goes on trips worth tens of thousands of dollars, sipping $1,700 bottles of champagne, while at the same time comes to Ottawa so he can oppose policies that give free food to kids in school.
Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, foreign interference poses a real threat to Canadians and our democracy. In this context, it's alarming that all but one of the opposition leaders obtained their security clearance. I have a simple question for the leader of the Conservative Party.
He's got Liberal MPs that have been ousted.
Address risk within his own party and put...
Liberal MPs that have been ousted.
Make sure that the Honourable Member...
Mary Ng is right there.
Has 17 seconds left on the clock, but as you know, questions in question period need to be directed towards...
Focus it on, bro.
The Honourable Member.
Mary Ng out.
Mr. Speaker, foreign interference poses a real threat to Canadians and our democracy. In this context, it's alarming that all but one of the opposition leaders obtained their security clearance. Mr. Speaker, to the federal government, what are we doing to ensuring that the security of our democracy...
The Conservatives are laughing.
Opposition leaders get their security...
The Conservatives were laughing because he couldn't get through his speech.
The Honourable Order. The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
As my colleague from Vaughan Woodbridge said, foreign interference poses a real threat for Canada's national security. Foreign actors want to create uncertainty in our institutions.
Mary Ng is literally
foreign interference seriously and stop the spread of that uncertainty.
within 5 feet of you. You could throw a pencil at her. I could probably spit a loogie that far. She's right there.
The Honourable Minister.
She's right there.
At the top.
Mr. Speaker, as my colleague pointed out, foreign interference poses a real threat to Canada's national security. Foreign actors want to create uncertainty in our institutions. It's time for all of us to take foreign interference seriously and stop the spread of that uncertainty. This includes the Conservative leader. Once again, I have a simple message for him in 3-word phrases that the leader of the Conservative Party is sure to understand. It's time to get the clearance, take the briefing, protect the country.
You had to look at your notes for that? Release names. Release. Look, he's not reading the book.
The Honourable Member from Kelowna Lake Country.
After 9 years of these NDP Liberals, they are not worth the cost of housing. They doubled rent, doubled mortgage payments, doubled down payments, and homeless encampments have opened in record numbers across Canada. Most young adults believe they will never afford a home. The federal GST adds a staggering cost to home costs, and the Common Sense Conservatives said today that we will axe the federal sales tax on new homes sold. For example, on an $800,000 house, this will save home buyers $40,000. Wow. Will the NDP Liberals axe the federal tax on housing, or will they continue to fund their housing photo op programs?
The Honourable Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for her question. It's interesting because she represents a part of Kelowna. I was in Kelowna a year ago last week to announce the Housing Accelerator Fund would be contributing $31.5 million to her community. What her leader actually announced this morning is that he's going to cut that fund. She is now in the awkward position of defending an increase of taxes to her constituents of $31.5 million. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we're going to advocate for programs that get homes built, not for cuts to the communities that we represent, which is simply shameful.
The Honourable Member from Kelowna Lake Country.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals' own housing advisors said this morning that the Liberals' photo op fund, the so-called Housing Accelerator Fund, is either pointless or ineffective. And this government has spent billions of dollars. And in fact, housing starts are down by Canada's 2 largest cities, 20% in Vancouver and Toronto each. Under this NDP Liberal government, housing costs have doubled, rising faster than any other G7 country. And this is a made-in-Canada issue. In 2015, it took 39% of the average Canadian's income to cover home ownership costs, and now it's 60%. Conservatives will axe the federal tax on new homes over $1 million. Will the government listen and...
The Honourable Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable colleague is very proud to stand beside her leader who's advocating that he's going to raise taxes by $31.5 million on ratepayers.
You're standing next to traitors.
Last week, I personally announced where I shared with the Council, including the former Conservative Member of Parliament for Kelowna, that they were grateful for this money that was going to help them build homes more quickly. In this House, it is unbelievable to me that any Member of Parliament would listen to their constituents at home, come to Ottawa, and demand that Ottawa take money from them. We are going to advance programs that build homes and support communities. It is unthinkable that a member would come and oppose money for the...
The Honourable Member from Durham.
Mr. Speaker, I'm having a hard time listening to the Liberal Housing Minister defend policies from his government that have failed an entire generation of Canadians from our generation who dream of owning a home one day. He continues to talk about the Housing Accelerator Fund, but the Liberals' own housing advisor describes this fund as nothing more than a heist of tax dollars flowing from the feds to the municipalities. That's right. We know the NDP Liberals have turned their backs on a generation of Canadians. When will they stop overtaxing housing so young Canadians can buy a home?
Not good question.
Put some W's in the chat for not so new guy.
Communities.
Mr. Speaker, it's interesting to me how often I see the Canadian Conservatives borrow their policy positions from right-wing populists in the United States.
Yes,
that might
right.
be where this particular member learned to advocate for programs that would cut affordable housing. Perhaps it was when he was chatting with his roommate at Yale Law School that he learned how to oppose programs that were going to provide birth control to Canadian women. Maybe it's his engagement in the United States that causes him to deal with the policies to legalize assault-style firearms. Mr. Speaker, in this House, on the side of the...
We don't have assault-style firearms in Canada.
More homes more quickly, not oppose them at every turn.
We don't have assault-style firearms in Canada.
From Gerb.
It's no surprise that this Liberal housing minister continues to turn his back on a generation of Canadians because he's clearly not focused on his job. He wants to talk about what's happening in other countries. Let's talk about what's happening in our country, Mr. Speaker.
That's right.
The last time Conservatives were in
Well said.
houses cost half of what they cost right now. Currently today, under this Liberal government, nearly 39% of the total taxes on new homes in Ontario are going to politicians and bureaucrats in Ottawa. When will this government agree with Conservatives and end the federal GST on housing so young Canadians can...
Damn! Put some W's down. Move them to the front of the bench.
The Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker.
Tell you what we will never agree with. We will never agree to the Conservative agenda of cuts and austerity. Cuts that will hit the most vulnerable hardest. And Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives, they've been trying to hide their true colors from Canadians. But today, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader, he made a mistake. And he admitted what he really intends to do. I'm going to quote him.
Put you guys in jail.
To cut 2 programs for sure, and more beyond that. So the question today is, what are they going to cut next? And we know it, everything that Canadians...
Yes, they know what's best for Canadians. 2 million people per month at food banks across this country.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this Liberal government, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. In the latest scandal to hit the Canada Revenue Agency, over 60,000 taxpayers had their personal private information hacked. Not only are these individuals' information floating around on the internet, it also costs taxpayers money. Over $190 million have been improperly paid to scam artists because of privacy breaches at Revenue Canada. Wow. Will the minister get information, call in the RCMP about this privacy breach, and so that taxpayers can be repaid?
That's right. Then I have Ministre Revenu National.
The Minister of National Revenue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Fraud is completely unacceptable. We agree on this, and our government is undertaking necessary measures. Money. The agency, rather, is a choice of target. There's a lot of personal information, many benefits are administered, tax returns as well. But the agency systems are solid. And when there is fraud attempts, we can inform the person who's been affected. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Dufferin-Caledon.
Unifor Local 1541 has been without a contract since March of 2023, and they've been on strike for almost 6 months. The employer has called Canadian workers lazy, refused to negotiate a wage increase, refused to bargain, and is effectively trying to bust the union. The union met with this NDP Liberal minister almost 2 months ago and took the unprecedented step of asking the minister to intervene. His response, crickets. Why is this NDP Liberal minister abandoning Unifor Local 1541?
Good question.
Wow.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and for Seniors.
Mr. Speaker, the government, of course, is monitoring the situation closely, indeed daily.
Shut up.
With the parties and available to assist at any time, and we urge them to continue their efforts to reach agreements. The Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission will continue to monitor this company for regulatory compliance to ensure the safety of workers, the public, and the environment. The facility remains secure. There have been no changes to the security of the site. And of course, Mr. Speaker, we will not let workers down, and we've made it repeated entreaties to the owner to return to the bargaining table.
The honourable member from Dufferin-Caledon.
I can tell the Unifor workers at Local 1541 are going to be absolutely inspired by that heartfelt response from this NDP Liberal minister. Why are these NDP Liberals never responsible for anything, Mr. Speaker? 2 million Canadians using a food bank? Not our fault. Violent thugs out on bail? It's the province's fault. A local employer trying to bust a union? There's nothing we can do but read these talking points. If these NDP Liberals aren't responsible for anything and they can't fix anything, why don't they get out of the way and let a common sense Conservative government fix their mess?
The Honourable Minister for Labour and for Seniors.
We'll take no lessons from this right-to-work Conservative Party in terms of labour relations in Canada. The people who've stood up repeatedly to vote to remove power from unions, to force unions to reveal their financial statistics, and also to make sure that unions find it hard to certify in workplaces. These union-busting Conservatives will give us no lessons. I work daily with my colleague from Canada Carleton on this issue, and we will make sure that these workers get the negotiations and the contract that they deserve.
Hear, hear.